Section 1. A Life Stolen. The Scalding Death of Darren Rainey. Darren Rainey, a man battling schizophrenia, found himself ensnared in the unforgiving grip of the American prison system. His story, like many others, began with a minor offense: possession of cocaine. Instead of receiving the help he desperately needed, Darren was thrust into the Dade Correctional Institution, a place meant to punish, not rehabilitate. Little did he know his sentence would become a death sentence, marked by unimaginable cruelty. On June 23, 2012, Darren Rainey's life was tragically cut short. Darren's cries for help echoed through the prison corridors, only to be met with indifference. He was subjected to a horrific act of torture, locked in a scalding hot shower for nearly 2 hours, his pleas for mercy ignored. His burned and blistered body, a testament to the brutality he endured, became a symbol of a system that had failed him. Darren's story is not an isolated incident. It is a chilling reminder of the systemic issues that plague our prisons. Darren's case lays bare the urgent need for reform in our criminal justice system. We must confront the inhumane treatment, the lack of accountability, and the deep-seated indifference that pervades these institutions. It is a call for justice, not just for Darren, but for all those who have suffered silently behind bars. His story compels us to act, to demand change, and to fight for a system that values human dignity and compassion. Section 2. The shower became his inferno, a timeline of terror. June 23, 2012 started like any other day for Darren Rainey. He was 50 years old, mentally ill, and incarcerated for a minor drug offense. He was housed in the Transitional Care Unit of the Dade Correctional Institution, a unit specifically designated for inmates with mental health needs. Ironically, this unit, meant to offer care and support, would become the stage for his horrific demise. That fateful evening, Darren had an episode. He defecated in his cell, a common symptom of his schizophrenia. This seemingly minor incident triggered a chain of events that would lead to his death. 2 correctional officers, angered by the mess, decided to punish Darren. They escorted him to the shower, a space they had modified into a torture chamber. The shower stall, small and windowless, had no cold water. Scalding hot water flowed from the pipes, reaching temperatures of up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Darren was locked in this inhumane chamber, left to endure the excruciating pain. For nearly 2 hours, his screams echoed through the prison wing. His pleas for help, for mercy, were ignored by the very people entrusted with his care. Section 3. Deaf Ears and Blind Eyes, the Systemic Negligence. Darren Rainey's agonizing death was not a sudden, unpredictable tragedy. It was the result of a long series of failures, a systematic breakdown of humanity and accountability within the walls of Dade Correctional Institution. The warning signs were plentiful, but they were ignored, dismissed, and swept under the rug. The prison was notoriously understaffed, with guards often overwhelmed and ill-equipped to handle the complex needs of mentally ill inmates like Darren. The culture of silence, deeply entrenched in the prison system, prevented any meaningful intervention. Other inmates, witnesses to Darren's suffering, were too afraid to speak out, fearing retaliation from the guards. Those who dared to raise concerns were met with indifference or threats. The guards, operating with impunity, knew that their actions would have no consequences. The lack of proper oversight and accountability mechanisms created a breeding ground for abuse. The prison system, tasked with rehabilitation and reform, had devolved into a place of cruelty and neglect. Darren's tragic death exposed the deep-rooted flaws that permeate these institutions. It highlighted the dehumanizing treatment of inmates, particularly those with mental illness. Section 4. Justice Delayed, Justice Denied, the Flawed Investigation. In the aftermath of Darren Rainey's horrifying death, one would expect an immediate and thorough investigation, a quest for justice. However, the reality proved to be a bitter disappointment. The initial investigation, marred by inconsistencies and a lack of urgency, seemed more like a cover-up than a genuine pursuit of truth. Evidence was mishandled, witness testimonies were ignored, and a veil of secrecy shrouded the entire process. The Miami-Dade medical examiner, tasked with determining the cause of Darren's death, ruled it accidental. They attributed it to a combination of his schizophrenia, heart disease, and confinement in the shower. This conclusion, widely criticized as flawed and incomplete, failed to acknowledge the role of the guard's actions in Darren's demise. Years passed with no charges filed against the correctional officers involved. The lack of accountability fueled public outrage and sparked protests, demanding justice for Darren Rainey. The case became a rallying cry for prison reform advocates, highlighting the urgent need for transparency and accountability within the criminal justice system. Darren's story, though tragic, became a catalyst for change, a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. Section 5. A broken system exposed, Rainey's case and beyond. Darren Rainey's tragic fate is not an isolated incident. It is a chilling example of the systemic failures that plague the American criminal justice system. His story shines a light on the brutal reality of prison life, particularly for those suffering from mental illness. Across the country, prisons are grappling with overcrowding, understaffing, and a lack of resources to adequately address the needs of mentally ill inmates. The dehumanization of prisoners, often seen as less deserving of basic human rights, creates an environment where abuse and neglect can thrive. The lack of transparency and accountability shields these injustices from public scrutiny, allowing them to persist unchecked. Stories like Darren's emerge with alarming regularity, each one a stark reminder of the urgent need for reform. The overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system further compounds these issues. Racial biases, both conscious and unconscious, influence every stage of the system, from arrest to sentencing. The result is a disproportionate number of black and brown individuals incarcerated, often for minor offenses. This cycle of mass incarceration has devastating consequences for individuals, families, and communities. Section 6. Echoes of Injustice, Parallels in the Criminal Justice System. The echoes of Darren Rainey's tragic death resonate far beyond the walls of Dade Correctional Institution. His story finds chilling parallels in countless other cases, revealing a disturbing pattern of abuse, neglect, and indifference within the criminal justice system. From the streets to the courtrooms to the prisons, the system seems to fail those it is meant to serve. The stories of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others highlight the deadly consequences of excessive force and racial bias in policing. The over-policing of communities of color, coupled with a lack of accountability for police misconduct, perpetuates a cycle of violence and injustice. The flaws in the system extend beyond law enforcement. The lack of access to adequate legal representation, particularly for low-income individuals, often results in wrongful convictions and excessive sentences. The overuse of cash bail further disadvantages the poor, trapping them in a cycle of incarceration even before they have their day in court. Section 7. Ripple Effects, Rainey's Death and the Push for Reform. Darren Rainey's death, though tragic, ignited a firestorm of outrage and demands for change. It served as a stark reminder of the human cost of a broken system, galvanizing activists, lawmakers, and concerned citizens alike. His story became a rallying cry for prison reform, pushing the issue into the national spotlight. Advocacy groups, energized by the public outcry, intensified their efforts, demanding greater transparency and accountability within the prison system. They called for improved mental health care for inmates, an end to solitary confinement, and stricter measures to prevent and punish abuse. Lawmakers, feeling the pressure from their constituents, began to introduce legislation aimed at reforming the criminal justice system. Some states implemented measures to reduce prison populations, such as sentencing reform and increased use of alternatives to incarceration. Others focused on improving conditions within prisons, mandating better mental health care and increased oversight. Section 8. The unfinished fight, demanding accountability and change. While Darren Rainey's death sparked some positive changes, the fight for justice and systemic reform is far from over. The road ahead is long and arduous, requiring sustained effort and unwavering commitment from all stakeholders. Holding those responsible for Darren's death accountable is paramount. The guards who subjected him to such horrific abuse must be held legally responsible for their actions. But accountability goes beyond individual actors. It requires a systemic overhaul, a fundamental shift in how we approach justice in this country. We must move away from a punitive system that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation. Instead, we need to invest in community-based solutions, restorative justice programs, and mental health services that address the root causes of crime. Transparency and oversight are crucial to ensure that atrocities like Darren's death never happen again. Independent investigations of all deaths in custody, coupled with mandatory reporting requirements for prison staff, are essential steps towards greater accountability. The culture of silence that often protects abusers must be shattered, replaced by a system that encourages reporting and protects whistleblowers. Section 9. Honoring Darren Rainey, a call to action. Darren Rainey's story is not just a tragic tale of one man's suffering. It is a call to action, a reminder that we cannot remain silent in the face of injustice. We must honor his memory by fighting for a more just and compassionate society, one where every life is valued and protected. This fight requires more than just outrage, it demands action. We must educate ourselves about the systemic issues plaguing the criminal justice system. We need to understand the factors that contribute to mass incarceration, racial disparities, and the inhumane treatment of inmates. Knowledge is power, and only through understanding can we effectively advocate for change. We must use our voices to amplify the stories of those who have been silenced by the system. We can write to our elected officials, urging them to support legislation that promotes criminal justice reform. We can support organizations working tirelessly to challenge mass incarceration and advocate for the rights of incarcerated individuals. Section 10. Seeds of Hope. Planting the seeds for a more just future. The fight for justice in the wake of Darren Rainey's tragic death is daunting, but it is not without hope. Amidst the stories of pain, suffering, and systemic failures, there are glimmers of hope, signs that change is possible. Across the country, individuals, organizations, and communities are working tirelessly to create a more just and equitable society. The movement for criminal justice reform is gaining momentum, fueled by a growing awareness of the injustices inherent in the system. People from all walks of life are joining the fight, demanding an end to mass incarceration, police brutality, and racial disparities in the justice system. Grassroots organizations are leading the charge, working within communities most impacted by the system. They are providing legal aid, supporting formerly incarcerated individuals, and advocating for policy changes that promote rehabilitation over retribution. These efforts, though often challenging and underfunded, are planting the seeds for a more just future.